say to start with that I feel quite inadequate here. I'm not I'm not an academic in the same way as a lot of your other speakers are. But what I felt was important here today was the fact that this was Mick's last big project that he started. And I know that he would have wanted you all to know about it. So there it is, yes. So when Tony said about organising this conference, I felt it was quite important that I should get up here and try and tell you about it. Essentially, the Winscombe project is in Mick's own parish, so it contrasts in Chapwick in that respect. Mick had lived in the parish since about 1984, up until his death. So all the time that he'd been there, he felt that he shouldn't really be working in the parish, because there's this thing about, you know, not actually getting involved with the local people and so on. But when the Chapwick project was starting to come towards a close, I think he was particularly interested in the difference between that nucleated type of settlement and what we have in Winscombe itself. And do note that here again, Mick is up a ladder. He did have this thing about climbing up things, especially to photograph stuff. Now, to set the scene, we're down in Somerset. Chapwick is sort of like about the middle of the county, and Winscombe is the parish that is further north. In fact, at the moment, we're actually in North Somerset, but it is within the actual historic county of Somerset. As well as that, Winscombe is very much a similar size to Chapwick, and that's quite important. But the big difference between these two settlements, here you can see Chapwick with its central village, all nucleated. Winscombe, completely different. Settlements just scattered across the whole parish. And within the medieval records, there are at least 22 different places mentioned. And as we go through the records, we do still keep coming up with so-and-so living at such and such place, which we haven't met before. So the number of little sites are sort of like still seem to be increasing. There are certain similarities between Winscombe and Chapwick. Both have areas of moorland within them, like the Somerset levels. The top part of Winscombe here is all moorland, as was the top part of Chapwick. Also, there's quite a bit of upland grazing in Winscombe. Winscombe was actually owned by Glastonbury Abbey. Now, many of you will think that you don't know anything about Winscombe at all, but quite possibly, as you have been sat in one of these traffic jams as you go down the M5, you will have passed the end of Winscombe parish. You can see, as you go south of Bristol, you can see Crook Peak in the background there, which rises up before you. And if at that point you look across that side, you will look up the Winscombe Valley. And that's important to know. Now, the other thing is that you might think that you know something about Chapwick as well. Not Chapwick, something about Sandford, because Sandford is a part of Winscombe, and it's where Thatchers brew their cider. And you will have all seen that advert with the balloon drifting across and knocking down tents and so on. And as it goes across, you see it drifts past Sandford Church. Well, wherever it is, it's not Sandford. So when you look at that next, you'll be able to cross that off your list of places. Now, the geology is quite important here. This is the Winscombe Valley, and it is tucked within the end of Mendip. Now, the blue areas across here are all the limestone. It's quite exceptional in this aspect because if you go eastwards from here, you just have the great block of the highland of Mendip. And then if you go slightly west, you come to the Bristol Channel, but that's also part of Mendip. And this is one of the very few places where you can actually cross the Mendips at this lower level. And you will see that this has been made use of because this is the route of the M5 coming down through here. And then at this side of the parish, you have the A38 cutting across the Mendips as well. So this parish is sort of like a point of natural routeways across the Mendip. And I think that's quite important. Just down to the south here, we have Axbridge, which was an Alfredian burh. And I think one of the reasons that that burh or fortress was placed there was because of this access across Mendip. So it had a particular design in being put where it was. This is just to give you some idea of what the topography of the site of Winscombe is like. On the top left there, you're looking from the east down across the Winscombe Valley, and you can see out between the hills. Crook Peak is on the left. Out between the hills, you can just see the little white bit which is the Bristol Channel, and then the Quantock Hills beyond that. On this side, this is Sandford Hill. It's been quarried extensively in the 19th and 20th, into the 20th century. Limestone again. And over here we have Winscombe Church, which is actually just perched on the side of the hill. Winscombe is now not within the village of Winscombe as such, which sounds a bit odd, but early on this was Winscombe. What is now called Winscombe was Woodborough, so names have moved. Then coming out onto the levels, you can see that this Reen waterway coming through here, this is the Liddy Yo Reen, and it forms the northern boundary of the parish. Oops, sorry, can I go back one? Swipe. Oh, you've, no, I've not got that right, sorry. That's that one, so yes. Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to roughly run through the prehistory and the history of the parish. This is the prehistory bit is not something that we have been concentrating on, but this just gives you a flavour of what we know was going on. We know there are two standing stones within that Winscombe Valley. The one on the left there is known as the Wimblestone. The other one is called the Yarbury Stone, and the Yarbury Stone actually now appears to have been part of a small stone row. Some work has been done on geophysics there and a bit of excavation, and we now know that that formed part of the stone row. We have a Paleolithic hand axe, which Phil has very ably written up in the Somerset proceedings. So if you want to know about that, that's where you go for that. Up in the top right here, we thought, first of all, the stone axe on the left-hand side. This came out, somebody was digging a post hole in their garden. Great excitement. We found this polished stone axe. So off it went down to Somerset Museum, and from there it went off to the Polished Stone Axe Group. And report came back, it comes from the South Pacific, and it's relatively modern. So, like, oh, okay, that's not quite what we were expecting. Little bit later on, when we were digging a test pit up by Sidcutt School, another of these polished stone axes. You know, Micks getting really excited again. Oh yes, you know, I definitely think we've got one this time, you know, make up for the last one. That goes off to the Stone Axe Group again. Word comes back a second time. It's another one from the South Pacific. Now, you know, this was starting to get a little bit odd, as you can imagine. And it took us some time to rack our brains to try and work out what was going on here. But the Sidcutt part of the parish, there is a large Quaker school, and the Quaker school has been there since about the 1650s. We decided that what must have been going on was that perhaps missionary or entrepreneurs had been coming back and bringing these samples of stone axes back to the school as exhibits, and that potentially at one point they formed part of a cabinet of curiosities, and that subsequently that had been disbanded, they'd been thrown out, and the gardener for the school had decided that they actually made quite good sharpening stones. So the first of them, it appeared, was found on the edge of the gardener's cottage, and the second one was found in the area where the glass houses were. So to date, that's our best explanation for why we've got so many hand axes from the South Pacific. There's a spread of flint across the whole area, and we've come across this in our test bits, but at the moment it's not really showing us anything in particular. It's just there as background noise. One of the big differences between Winscombe and Shapwick is that Winscombe is a very pastoral landscape, so we don't have that big opportunity to go out there and field walk. So we essentially, what we get out of our test pits is really all the material that we're going to be gathering in that respect. Moving forward in time, just on the edge of Winscombe is this Banwell Hill Fort. You can just see the quarried hill of Sandford just behind that. So we know there's Iron Age stuff going on in the vicinity. And if you come this way along the side of the hill, just the south of Banwell, there seems to be quite a bit of Roman activity. And this is known as the Wind Hill Bowl. It's in the Ashmolean Museum, and it was actually found in excavations that happened in the 1950s. It was suggested that there was some sort of villa on the side of the hill, and this, which is a 4th century bowl from Cologne, came out of those excavations. Here you can actually see one of the trenches with skeleton in the bottom there, and there were quite a few skeletons that actually came from this site. Unfortunately, the landowner at the time was very superstitious, and a lot of the material was just thrown down a well, apparently. But some of it was salvaged and ended up in Axbridge Museum. And one of the things that Mick was doing, he was looking at Dark Age burials in Somerset. And a lot of excavations that had taken place in Somerset in the sort of like 50s, 60s, hadn't had any radiocarbon dating done. And so he was attempting to track these excavations down and get radiocarbon dates done on the bones to, give us a bit more clue about what was going on. So we managed to find 2 skeletons from Wind Hill, and they were both sent off for testing. And the first one came back with dates between 430 and 610. And the second one then came back between 640 and 810. So this was actually very exciting because it meant that the Roman stuff that was going on that hillside, whatever was going on, had continued into this Dark Age period. And just on the other side of the hill, you have the settlement of Banwell, which was an important early Christian centre. We know that in King Alfred's time, there was a Minster church there. And this might indicate that perhaps there was something of British Christianity going on in the vicinity before Banwell itself was founded. Now, just to move into the historic period, you can see Winscombe here is nicely illustrated with stripes, just to reflect one of Mick's jumpers there. But Winscombe itself formed part of what was a greater Banwell estate, which you can see here. That's the bit in white, and Banwell is just there in the middle of it. And it was in the reign of King Edgar, which is between 959 and 975, that this parish was actually carved out of that greater estate, and it was given to a woman who was known as Aylesworth. And she was an important woman. Her husband was alderman in Hampshire, and between them they held quite a lot of land across the whole of the south of England. So near all of the royal estates, the king at this period would have been peripatetic and would have moved about southern England. And it seems that they were given bits of land in the near vicinity of a lot of these estates, which presumably would have enabled them to accompany him across southern England on his tours around. There has been some suggestion that this part of the parish, because it's such an odd shape, that this part of the parish was actually added on at a later date. However, that doesn't take into account that this area, Shipham, which has subsequently become a separate parish, was probably part of the original grant. And we think this is the case because Shipham Church pays an amount of money to Winscombe Church. So if it had been given later, you would have expected it to have paid the money to Banwell Church as the mother church. So we think that it was probably part of the original, which means that it's not such an unusual shape if that was the case. The next thing that we know in the historic record is the Doomsday entry, and that's something that you get for most of the parishes in the country. What I've done here, I've shown the map of the parish, and also this is like a representation of the actual Winscombe holding, and it divides into 3 different types of holding. So the first was owned by Glastonbury, because when Aylesworth died, she left Winscombe to Glastonbury Abbey. And at Doomsday, you have a third of the parish being farmed directly by Glastonbury Abbey. Another third of the parish is farmed by the Villains, so that's the tenants of Glastonbury Abbey. But then the rest of the parish is split up between knights. So there's a chap called Roger of Coursoy who holds a lot of that land in southern England, and he holds a big chunk of the parish. We have then a slightly smaller subtenant called Ralph Taughtmain, or Crooked Hands, and he holds an area. So Roger of Coursoy, we've worked out that his holding is here in Woodburn, in the centre of the parish. Up at the far end of the parish and up through Sandford, we have the holding of Ralph Taughtmain, and then there's a very small holding that's only half a burgate, so that's about 60 acres, and that's out at Barton. And the interesting thing about that one is that it's owned by a chap named Pipe, and he doesn't occur in any other place within the whole country. So his only holding is in Barton, and this must mean that he was actually living there. Whereas the other 2 tenants, because they're great landowners, their place of residence is elsewhere. It's not within Winscombe, and their areas of land would have been sublet. The interesting thing that happens next is that, so Winscombe is held by Glastonbury Abbey, but you reach a point of about the 1190s when Bishop Saverack of Wells actually makes a plea to the king, and he takes over the abbacy of Glastonbury. So as well as being Bishop of Bath and Wells, he also becomes Abbot of Glastonbury. Obviously the monks didn't like this very much. And they spent a lot of time petitioning the Pope to try and get back their own sort of like, well, to be able to elect their own abbot again. And finally, in 1215, they managed to elect an abbot again. But what happens then is the bishop decides that he's going to keep some of Glastonbury's estates because he's been deprived of all that income, and he doesn't think that's fair. This is interesting because we then have a reference in 1610. There's a chap called John Selden who wrote a book on dueling, and it tells us that Glastonbury Abbey and Wells Cathedral fought a contest over 4 parishes. And there's a little description in this book of dueling about what was going on at this point, which I will just read to you. It says that both the champions, so Glastonbury and Wells, both appointed somebody to fight on their behalf. And both the champions had to appear before the court bareheaded, ungirt, uncloaked, and with bare feet. And then on the day of the battle, they had to appear again. They had to be bare-legged from the knee downwards, bare up to the elbow, and nothing on their heads. And they actually fought with a staff of an el's length. So that's about a yard and a quarter. And we don't know the outcome. We don't have written evidence of the outcome of this. But it seems that Wells must have been able to appoint a better champion because the estate, Winscombe, actually stays with the bishop and it doesn't go back to Glastonbury Abbey. Now, this is quite important in the history of the parish because instead of it then going into private hands at the dissolution, it actually stays within the bishopric. It gets given to the dean and chapter. And there are properties within Sandford and Winscombe that still belong to the dean and chapter in the early 20th century. So you have well over 1,000 years of ecclesiastical ownership within the parish. And I think that's quite important because it's given it a sort of like stability that, well, it's almost put it in a straitjacket and things have not moved within the parish in the way of ownership. So that's like a brief history of what's going on in the parish. And I'm just going to run through a few of the things that we've been doing in order to look at what's going on there. The parish has got a set of compotus rolls and court rolls, and these are all in medieval Latin and look like this. They're quite difficult to decipher. However, Martin Eccleston, who also worked on the Shapwick project, managed to actually transcribe and translate a lot of these medieval records. They're full of really interesting information, as well as just telling you, accounting for every last item of what was going on in the parish. They also tell you interesting things like building repairs, who's inheriting which bits of land, what they have to pay in the way of mortuary payments when they die, how much cheese is being produced. The cheese was quite interesting because up until the 1340s, there were about 13.5 stone of cheese being produced on the Winscombe estate. But then when you look at the records, it just disappears. And this came to our notice to start with because they accounted for the Christmas feast. So the Christmas feast would have X amount of cheese was being used for the Christmas feast. Then all of a sudden, they start having to buy cheese in. And I thought, well, where's all the cheese gone that they were producing? And having searched through the records, we found that instead of keeping their own herd, what they do is they actually farm it out. So there's a little tiny entry in there that says that they get 72 shillings for farming out the lactage. So they're farming out the herd and they're getting somebody else to do it. So you've actually got a change in farming techniques at that point. And, you know, this is apparent from looking through these medieval records. The tenancies over time are quite interesting. There are two things known as custumals within the parish, and the custumals actually list all of the tenants who are there and how much land they hold and how much they pay for it and what their duties are. And we have different sorts of land holding. They come down in size. So the biggest land holding is a virgate, and that's about 30 acres of arable. And then half virgate is 15 acres. We have some third virgate holdings, which are 10 acres. And then you get down to the smaller holdings, like a furling, which is 7.5 furling. And then you get down to the really tiny holdings, which are the cottars, and they only hold 1 to 2 acres. And you can see through time. So the blue is the virgate. So as far as we know, this is what it's like in the Doomsday book. And it only gives you a description of 2 different sorts of holdings at that point. So I think they're probably a bit amalgamated. However, in 1189, this is when it's in the hands of Glastonbury, you can see that there aren't as many big holdings. That's shrunk. But there are different ones here, and it's the first custumal. And the really striking thing is that when it goes into the hands of Wells, is that the arrangement changes completely. So instead of this large number of people with a virgate holding, it goes down to only 3 people who hold that amount of land. When you look at what's going on, however, the people who are all holding these virgate holdings at this point, you get 2 and 3 people who are actually on the same holding because the holdings have been split up. And I think all that's happened here is that when the bishops have got hold of it, is that they've regularized it. So if you had a holding that was shared between 3 people, they've divided it into either thirds or they've divided it into half. So the number of whole virgates has gone down, whereas the number of half virgates has risen up quite impressively. Just the other thing to notice about this is that there's a slight drop in the number of tenancies around about the time of the Black Death, but it's not a huge amount. And it does then slowly, over the next 50 to 100 years, go back up to what it was before. Another thing that we've looked at, as well as the written documents, have been the maps. This particular map was found by the 2 people here, Chris and Nick Briscoe, who live in this cottage, which is this one here. They actually found it when they were living in Wells, and it was in the roof of the property they were in, which had been a firm of solicitors back in earlier times. And this was rolled up in the roof and providing some sort of like insulation, along with a lot of other documents. And when they opened it up, they immediately recognized that it says it's Woodborough Green because Chris's mum lived in Woodborough at the time. So they were quite excited about this. So within the centre of Winscombe, there's this large area of green with some houses on it that you can just see here and up along this bit. But what you should also note is coming down this side, which might be quite difficult for you to see, there are little pictures of winding gear. And we think that this map was drawn up in the 1650s because at that point, the bishop was actually, and the dean and chapter, were letting the greens and commons of Winscombe out for prospection, for lead. And obviously, as you can see, there are little lead mines running up on the side of the green. This is one of Mick's aerial photographs of the village. So again, you can see that triangular shape that we saw just now. Nick and Chris's house is just off the end. But what you should also note is that coming up here, over the top of all those mines, it's now all housing. And when we have one of our fine surgeries, there were people along this area of settlement who were bringing in big lumps of bluish coloured material, which appeared to be lead smelting waste, which is not so good, really. It's not really what you want in your garden. Nick, as you know, you've heard, was very keen on the aerial photography. Here you can see him up in the helicopter up above the parish. Now, having lived with Mick for so long, I can confidently tell you that this is a helicopter known as a Robinson. And one of the things that, because Mick was so interested in helicopters, his son took up this interest, and it is actually his son James who is flying the helicopter at this point. However, since then, like a lot of other people, we have had to move on to a drone. So if we need anything from the air now, we have to use a drone. The other things that we've had done, like Shapwick, we have done the building survey. Now, as well as the vernacular buildings, we've also had somebody working on the gentlemanly residences or villa residences, of which there are quite a lot in Winscombe itself. The one on the top left there is a nice arts and craft type of building, and it was built by George Oakley, who was a renowned architect within Bristol, who came to live within the parish. One of our buildings, which you can see here, and the finger is pointing at the drill hole. There was a dendrochronology date done on this particular beam, and it turned out that this was 1288 in date, and it turned out to be the oldest still lived in vernacular building within the county of Somerset. So we were quite pleased about that. And it's strangely coincident that it dates to the earliest of our compoter scrolls. So when we look at that compoter scroll and it tells us about what's going on in the farming and everything, we know that that was all taking place at the time that this building was actually being built. And that survey, again, was done by the Somerset Vernacular Research Group. That has been published. Geophysics, we had our friendly local geophysicists down to do some work. You can see Jimmy there, and John is up the top there. And there were several sites within the parish that Mick particularly felt needed some work doing on them. One of them was a field called Wyke. Well, we think it was a field called Wyke. We have a settlement that appears to disappear. It's there in the early records. It doesn't survive as a place name into the modern period. However, within the description of the tenements, Mick had sort of like worked out whereabouts in the parish it should be. And then as we were out walking one day, we came across this field that had, it's got quite deep hollow ways running across it. You can see one at the top there and one coming down this way. And it's quite a lot of earthworks going on in there. And Mick felt that this potentially was the site of Wyke. We have subsequently done some test bits in it, only 3 at the moment. And I think that perhaps the lumps and bumps are actually part of this mining business that's going on, because there was no medieval pottery, but a lot of evidence of industrial process within the field. So we do have to keep still looking for the settlement of Wyke. However, we've got this interesting situation where we have a few settlements within the village that don't seem to have a name that links back to the medieval records. So it's possible that one of those was actually Wyke and that the name has just been lost. One thing that you should notice on our breakfast table here is the big pot of Marmite. Nick was a real Marmite fan, and he used to eat it almost about ½ an inch thick. So yes, fine surgeries. We invited the people in the local hamlets to actually bring in anything that they had found in their gardens. And when we first started the test pitting in the parish, the couple who are in this photograph here didn't quite understand what we were going to do and got their son to dig a test pit. And they came up with lots of medieval roof tile here. We subsequently dug about 3 test pits in their garden and only found about 1 piece of it. So that's sort of like beginner's luck with them, I think. But their house was in the middle of this area here. And I think that with our thinking now is that this was probably the main site of the house of the person who was the tenant of Roger Coursoy. So one of these little manorial divisions within the parish actually had its centre here, and that their house is on top of that area. Then our test pitting. Mick was anxious to do test pits within the parish, partly because we'd used the technique at Chapwick, as you've heard. The settlement pattern is so different here, all these different little settlements all over the place. He wanted to push the date of our medieval records back and see if any of these tenements that we could identify actually went back into the pre-conquest period. And there have been quite a few of them now that we actually are getting pre-conquest pottery from. So essentially what you've got happening in Winscombe is probably different to Chapwick in that instead of all that settlement coming together in one village, it has remained as dispersed settlements throughout the parish. And there might be several reasons for this. At one point, Winscombe actually formed part of the Forest of Mendip. So the king had hunting rights within there, and people weren't allowed to cut down wood and expand their agriculture. And I think perhaps that might have prevented things happening in that respect. Also, the geology is quite different from what we had at Chapwick, and there's quite a bit of land on Mercian mudstone, and it's not hugely good for arable, whereas it makes very good pastoral land. And I think perhaps, you know, these different features are probably the difference between it mutating into a nucleated settlement and it staying as a dispersed settlement, as we see here. So, sorry, oh, that's right. This is just to show you some of the results from the actual village of Winscombe itself. So here's the church on the side of the hill, and this is the court building. So this is when the Dean and Chapter's representatives came across from Wells. That was where they stayed. That was where they did their accounting. They held the court there. And so it was the most important focus within the parish. This actually, north is up on this one and down on that one, so you're going to have to turn that round inside your head. So the church is here and the court building's here. When we plotted out the different material from the test pits, the medieval material, we found that there's a lot more glazed material actually in the medieval period, just over where the court area is, but the court, the actual curia of the court extended over this area. And it appears that this area down here, it's got a lot more unglazed fabrics, and I think these might be associated with storage vessels because that's where the barns and other areas of the farming were situated within it. One of the things that I've been struck with doing the test pits in Winscombe is that we do seem to have a higher proportion of glazed medieval wares than we had at Chapwick. Chris referred me on to looking at material from Warren Percy, where they also had this situation. And it might be that it relates perhaps to the pastoral nature of the economy. We're not quite sure yet. We've got to watch this space and see what happens with that one. A chap called Paul Harvey actually wrote a really interesting book on Cuxham in Oxfordshire, where he looks at all the records that were associated with the village of Cuxham. And one of the things that he does is he actually makes this conjectural plan of the area around the manor house. And I thought that would be worth doing for Winscombe. So I went through all the different references to the different buildings that showed up around the manor. We've got things, there's something called a Frank house. We know, we see the garderobe mentioned at one point. We know there's a dovecot. We know that there's a separate kitchen. There are at least 2 barns, a tithe barn and a granary barn. We also know that there are things like a hen house, a pig house, a house for the cows, and the sheep as well. So looking at the topography of the area and knowing where the hall was and things, I've tried to actually try and work out where these different places are on the ground. So it's just an interesting exercise to try. We've also had James Bond in to do recording work on Woodborough Mill, the test pit there. And as well as that, we've been, sorry, it's not going to do it. No, oh no, I've gone too far now. Sorry, I seem to have lost my place again. I'm struggling with the technology. I apologize. Right. Okay, past that one, and past that one, and that one. There we are. This is Micks Bungalow within its hedged enclosure, in which he planted as many species as possible. So when it comes to be examined, it will be found to have been within an Iron Age enclosure. It has a well just out in the back because it does happen to be on the plot of an earlier tenement. And all this material laid out on the table here has all come out of the garden. So there's a lot of medieval pottery, there's actually pre-conquest pottery, and we've had some Roman pottery as well. So it does have a long history. And then we've used other things like LiDAR, and here you can see a LiDAR of the levels with the 2 small inhabited islands as such. The one on the left is quite interesting because the green that forms the parish boundary actually cuts through the island. And here we've got one of the islands. This is the island of Nye, picture of it taken with the drone there. And when we looked at the LiDAR here, we found that there was this area of quite dense earthworks at the far end of the island. And it now turns out that we've got some quite interesting place names associated with this. The first is, it refers to La Ive. Now, to start with, when I saw this, I thought it was talking about the island which is called Nye. But it's definitely La Ive, and I think this comes from a hive. And then I found another reference to that cut that you just saw going through Rookery Island, and it was called Liddy Yo, which again seems to come from that same word, Le Ive, and then the Yo bit meaning river. So it looks as if potentially we might actually have some sort of landing place here. And James Bond has been out and surveyed this, and there's actually quite what looks like a cut coming in here that has been filled in, and I've also filled in little sort of like ream running north from that, which potentially goes out to more reams that lead out to the sea. So we think that perhaps people might have been bringing stuff in here, perhaps in some sort of shallow punt, and doing stuff on the island. I mean, we're hoping to do more work on that and actually get some geophysics done and so on. But I want to just put this one up as the end, and I think I should just say that it's one of the hazards of test pitting that we all need to avoid. You will see that the diggers are actually very careful, and they've all got their knee protectors on. And this is what happens when you don't wear your knee protectors. So you can see it's not a fashion statement on Micks' part. That was actually his trousers ripped to shreds because he'd been doing too much archaeology in them. And I've been told that I need to finish at this point, so I'm going to stop there. And thank you for listening so patiently.
We'll break in a few minutes. Do think if there's any questions that you'd like to ask Teresa. There's one thing that I wanted to know. You referred to the medieval rolls 2 or 3 times. Where were they? Where did you find them? How did you access them?
They were actually preserved in the archive of Wells Cathedral. So obviously a lot of their material had disappeared through time. You know, it's been destroyed by fire, eaten by rats, all that sort of thing. But this certain proportion of it did actually survive.
And did people know they were there already? Or?
Yes, but they hadn't been worked on. Nobody had translated them or transcribed them. So that was, you know, a new step forward. But subsequently to Mick dying, we've also found that we've got more composers rolls for the bit called Winterhead. So we're actually scratching our heads at the moment because, you know, I've got a little group working on these, but it's quite a specialized thing, and it's quite complicated to try and, first of all, work out what the words are because they're in this abbreviated medieval Latin, and then to actually translate that into what's going on.
Do we know what that word composer?
Compoters, it just accounts, rolls, essentially. Yes, yeah. So it's where they account for every last item. You know, down to when an ox is slaughtered, they sell off the lard, they sell off it's all listed there, you know, and yes, it's incredible how nothing that is worth anything slips out of that. All that income is going off to Wales.
Anybody else? Yes, a lady over there. Anybody on this side?
The Bishop of Wells requiring or wanting the land from Glastonbury, was it personal wealth or was it status that gave them?
Well, I think whilst he was in control of the Glastonbury lands, a certain amount of that was actually going into his own personal wealth. And that was partly why, when, you know, the Pope let them elect their own abbot again, that he was a bit fed up with that because it was going to be an enormous drop in his income. So he did actually target these 4 parishes and try and, well, as you can see, he did hold on to them. And one of the interesting things about the Winscombe stuff with that, in that respect, is that Winscombe had belonged, when it was part of Bamwell, it had belonged to the bishop. So when King Edward granted that away, Bamwell went in and out of the hands of the bishop and the king. So sometimes it was bishop, sometimes it was king. And when the king granted that away, I think the bishops probably just held this as a grudge. So they actually saw this as an opportunity to get one of their areas, one of their estates back, you know, from Glastonbury. Because all through the Middle Ages, the bishops of Wells and the abbots of Glastonbury were at each other's throats. They were, you know, there was a lot of contention there over areas of the levels that were being reclaimed and all sorts of things like that. It wasn't an easy relationship.
Thank you. Just one more question, and then we ought to stop. I'll just get you the mic. Just for all of you listening online.
I just wondered on the origins of the parish boundaries.
Yes.
And whether there's evidence. How far back do they go? Do they
yes,
go back
yes,
to the Roman period, or where do they come from?
The earliest evidence that we don't have a charter for Winscombe itself. However, several of the parishes round about have charters, so we have bits of charter bounds that relate to other parishes round about, and that's our earliest evidence of the boundaries. However, there is that, I showed you that ream that was cutting through the island. That's quite interesting because it's some of the reams do actually get formed in Roman times. We've no idea what date that one is. It's interesting in that you have to, before you can start to drain levels and use them, for agriculture and so on, you have to channel the water that's coming off the highlands from round about so that doesn't just keep flooding your levels. So that actually channels the water that's coming out of the Tower Head Brook. And another one channels the springs from Banwell. And I think both of those must have been put in at the same time. And it's been suggested that the Banwell one was in Saxon times. But this is one of the things that we don't actually know. The fact that it cuts through the island, I think, is probably some sort of clue that I haven't quite worked out yet what it means. So I'm still working on that one.
I love the idea that you showed us that beautiful map of the parish as it was drawn in the time of King Edgar, who I think I'm right in saying was Alfred the Great's grandson. So actually what we're seeing is the story of a village from, as Michael Wood would say, the beginning of England as we know it right through to today.
Well, we hope it will be that when it gets
Big round for Teresa.
Thank you.